You want to start? Yeah. Today, our society member, Daniel Hoffman, will be discussing with us the United Nations NGO Committee on Freedom of Religion or Belief. Dan is a committee member there. He's on the board, and he'll share with us a bit about its background and also how the conflict between freedom of religion and freedom from religion is playing out on the world stage. Dan?
Thank you. So, the hope that universal human rights is achievable, it's like riding a bicycle. Humanity did it once, and we can do it again. It feels good to see a program or even a simple, small deed make a corner of the world, no matter how small, feel better. Focusing on the work of good people succeeding in making situations better nurtures our resilience. But it's hard to stay focused because so many things are fighting for attention in ever more clever and sophisticated ways. The promise of technology, particularly information technology, is deservedly getting mixed reviews. For example, I had a problem fixing the brakes on my car. The old rotor wouldn't come off. I tried banging it with bigger and bigger hammers. I mean, I used this giant sledgehammer. It wouldn't work. I hit it with a torch. It wouldn't work. So I said, why don't I go on YouTube? Within a few minutes, I saw this great trick using a couple of bolts, a few nuts and washers, and in no time at all, pop, it was off. Oh, my page just moved. Just like seeing that for the first time, I knew it would work easily. There's another thing I saw for the first time, and as soon as I saw it, I felt the same optimism. I learned about a path forward being proposed by the UN Human Rights Council. And I'll get to that particulars in a minute. The constant barrage of information about what is awful in the world around us, as well as the uncivil speech we find online, it wears us down. It dims our estimation of other people, and it saps our strength. I don't know about the rest of you, but there are some days that I find myself fighting the temptation of giving it all up, sailing to New Zealand and building myself a hobbit hut. Truth be told, things used to be worse, a whole lot worse. At the end of World War II, nations of the world came together and asked, how can we prevent these horrors from ever happening again? In creating the United Nations, they came up with two responses. One was to set up structures whereby nations could address their grievances and solve concrete problems. The other was to make explicit a set of core values that would apply to humanity as a whole. The world looked to the United Nations and felt hope. Not only did it seem so obviously like the right thing to do, it looked doable. There are structural and value statements in the founding documents of the United Nations. The documents that affirm its values look like they were cut and pasted from the various statements and lists that humanist groups put forward to describe what we stand for. Back in the 1950s, I'm told, most members of ethical culture were members of United Nations Association local groups. Right now, however, the United Nations is asking for our help. That's an understatement. They're begging us for our help. Their talented and committing people have been doing incredible work in building something of a consensus around hard issues. Among the most difficult is the question of freedom of religion or belief. Since 2011, there have been regular meetings of its Human Rights Council to implement what they call Resolution 1618. It was crafted to combat, unquote, intolerance, negative stereotyping and stigmatization of, and discrimination, incitement to violence, and violence against persons based on religion or belief. They drew up a clear action plan that is not just addressed towards states, Under the heading, implementation is the key, they called for, quote, meaningful exchanges of views and approaches with civil society, national human rights institutions, the media, and others. That includes us. In promoting some of our highest values, the UN has produced 3 important documents: the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of Intolerance and of Discrimination based on Religion or Belief, and Resolution 1618 of the Human Rights Council, consolidating consensus through implementation. While I'd love to talk about all of them in detail, it would take all day. I will provide a link to them and email it out on the listserv so that you guys can read them. Trust me, you'll love what they say. I was really surprised when I learned this, but what all these resolutions and declarations have as their enforcement mechanism what is called customary international law. Customary international law isn't what we think about when we think about laws. Take traffic laws, for example. You go too fast and you get a ticket. International treaties and conventions are in the same class as traffic laws. They are clear and specific. A nation that breaks a signed treaty or convention can be brought before the International Court of Justice. The 3 documents I just mentioned aren't treaties or anything like that, though they have inspired many treaties. Nations who don't follow them can also be brought before that UN court if 2 standards of customary international law are violated. Now, I went over to Weck's Law, and that's from Stanford University, and it's like the philosophy group. They put out wonderful, wonderful stuff. But they say that international customs and general practices of nations shall be one of the court's sources of customary international. It's one of the sources of international law. Customary international law can be established by showing 1, state practice, and 2, opinio juris. My very layperson understanding of what that boils down to is this, and it's very simple. Nobody does these things because everyone knows it's wrong. 2 specific examples of what I found on that page describing customary international law are: when a head of state visits another country, they don't get arrested. 2, we don't send refugees back to places where they are likely to be abused or tortured. I can think of at least 1 country that does that to refugees. If the United States were to be brought before the International Court of Justice using the structures provided in its charters, how would it defend itself? What would it say? It could list other nations that return refugees to places where they know they will become victims of abuse and argue that the world really doesn't meet the required general and consistent practice. Worse, nations can simply question whether customary international law is itself legitimate. Not everybody's on board. The rejection of the very notion of customary international law reminds me of a saying that a lot of you have heard. You cannot get an is from an ought. The objection boils down to, just because there should be a law against it doesn't mean that there is a law against it. I don't know about the rest of you, but when I first learned about the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I was really excited. I'm like, wow, the world has to follow these rules. Then I learned how it actually worked. And I felt like I was riding on my bike and suddenly saw a missing manhole cover in front of me. The structure that I was relying upon to carry us has a gaping hole in it. There's an important lesson about riding a bicycle that I want to share with you. One of the wonderful programs that the state of Pennsylvania created, and for which I am grateful, is a motorcycle safety training program. The most important lesson in it also applies to bicycles. To enroll in that training program, all I needed was a Pennsylvania learnings permit, a helmet, boots, and gloves. They, using your tax dollars, thank you very much, provided the motorcycles and a team of excellent instructors. As we all know, when riding a two-wheeled vehicle, hazards will show up on our path, often very unpredictably. Sometimes the objects that show up, like trees, rocks, and nice people, aren't bad in themselves. Other objects, like broken bottles, missing manhole covers, and other bicyclists who don't seem to care about their fellow human beings, are bad. The lesson we were taught about avoiding such perils was simple. Always look where you want to go and ignore the object you want to avoid. Stare at the tree, you're going to ride right into it. Stare into that gaping abyss exposed by that missing manhole cover, and it will gobble you up. The simple bit of advice is what I brought to our UN group years ago. I suggested that we always try to provide at least one success story at our meetings. Distractions like the pandemic kind of got us off our path a little bit, but don't worry, we're going to fix it. If the structures can't get us where we need to go, we need to go on the alternative path, which is to put faith in our values. I'm going to go back to the United Nations preamble just to remind you what they are. We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to humankind. I just cleaned that up a little. And here's the good part: to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small, for these ends, to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors. It's all right there in the preamble. To save succeeding generations, we reaffirm faith in the dignity and worth of the human person and in equal rights for everyone. That line assumes something. It assumes that we've all had such a faith before. You can safely wager that they carefully selected that word after considerable and vigorous discussion. I, for one, am grateful that its proponents held out for it. The really tricky thing comes down to what it means to be a good neighbor. It sounds non-controversial to say that we should be good neighbors and model positive behaviors, particularly in the conflict between freedom of expression and freedom from having people express to each other unwelcome views, such as the correct way of being good neighbors. When we do that, we run into all kinds of troubles. Being a good neighbor is another way of saying living within just structures. At this point, we have to ask the question, do our values come from living within just structures, or do just structures emerge out of our values? The relationship between structures and values often sounds like a chicken and egg problem. We ask, which comes first, the belief in justice or the practice of justice? There's this traditional view that goes back thousands of years, which some call the praxical view. It says that habits inform character, and that good habits mold us into good people. The way we view the world, seen in this light, arises out of how we live in the world, the day-to-day things we do. The practical view is about efficient causes. Our past determines our present. If you want people to be just, you raise them in a society where its members are expected to practice specific behaviors that follow the clearly defined just or righteous path set before them. This is an old and venerable viewpoint, long held by cultures and civilizations the world over. The problems with creating just structures as a method for raising ethical citizens has also been known for thousands of years. Who has the right to set those structures up? And how much force is acceptable to be used in the character formations of model citizens as a way of instilling proper habits? The 1618 resolution called limiting expression an exceptional measure of last resort and proposed strict rules for ever doing so. There's another view, a competing view that the world's held for a long time as well, and that is that our aspirational values pull us towards and give us the motivation to forge a world that is just. Better still, when we look to those values and affirm them, they don't just pull us forward, they unite us. They bring us together. There's a lot worth exploring in how the structures of the UN itself and the structures by which humanity operates in all the various places human beings find themselves could use improvement. There are gaping holes in those structures, and we often feel that there's no alternative path around them. As some of you know, I serve on the board of the United Nations Freedom of Religion or Belief non-governmental organization up at the UN, and have been regularly attending meetings for almost 20 years now. The issues that come before us, more often than not, have been horrific. Representatives of the Yazidi, the Baha'i, and the Rohingya, for example, have come before us requesting our assistance. Their stories are heartbreaking, and the list of abused groups often seems endless. Like the Ethical Society, our group genuinely wants to help in these situations. But what power do we really have? While the people who speak to us, as well as our members, both individually and on behalf of the groups we represent, can certainly advocate for positions before the UN and petition the UN, our group cannot publicly act or claim to act as a group who speaks for FORB. Our parent group, Congo, that's the Conference of NGOs in Consultative Relationship with the United Nations. The UN has all kinds of long names for groups, or the UN itself. We just can't. We cannot ask for interventions into the affairs of UN member states. Even if we could all go back to our member organizations and get a buy-in, it's not in our authority to call for a specific response to a specific issue that comes before us, no matter how much we want to do so. I looked up what our mandate actually empowers us to do. We can share information about issues. We do get a seat at the table where we can raise issues with entities who can petition the UN directly, but we cannot make such petitions as a group. Okay. There is one exception. We, meaning our group, founded to promote religion or belief, can remind everyone of our foundational principles and advocate for them. That is in our mandate. It also happens to be the second of the two responses of the United Nations to the horrors of the Second World War. It was 1948, after all, when the Universal Declarations of Human Rights was put forth. And I'd like to read you two articles in that. And I'm sorry for the gendered language. Anyway, Article 18, and that's religious rights advocates' favorite article, states, everyone has the right of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his or her religion or belief, and freedom, either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his or her religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. The next article, Article 19, states, everyone has the right of freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. Article 18 was the foundation of the later UDHR, and I encourage you all to have a look at it because it really is inspirational. Our group is diverse. We have the Baptist World Alliance, the Alliance Defending Freedom, the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints. They strongly prefer I say the whole thing, along with Catholics, Orthodox Jews, the Free Thought Society, and humanist groups like us. Between us, we have some serious disagreements about the proper role of religion in society. As individuals, we have come to like and respect each other. There's a reason we get along so well. In spite of our profound differences, which do show up in how we interpret freedom of religion or belief, we support some critically important values. Unfortunately, Article 19 and the 1618 resolution, I'll get to that in a sec, are not embraced by all of us. Religious fundamentalists oppose it vigorously because it rejects the equation of speech with violence, as well as all laws and policies prohibiting the defamation of religion. 1618 also asserts that the best cure for intolerance is what it calls the primary role of counter speech. That's where providing a space for speech that goes counter to the dominant narratives over a range of issues needs to be protected. While we all have our own long list of examples, the religious conservatives have given us counterexamples where they accuse us of censorship and they accuse us of unfairly equating their speech with violence. In the wider world, so many bottles have been thrown back and forth on these two topics, scattering broken glass everywhere, and we probably shouldn't be riding down that path today. Here's a positive path that is open to us. Let's look at the first two articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Its first sentence is a fantastic encapsulation of the core values of humanism and ethical culture. Quote, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. That sounds like what we believe in. The affirmation that reason and conscience are universal to us all and that we should treat each other as family in the very next line is something I read and marvel at. When the Universal Declaration came up for a vote, the Soviet Union and South Africa abstained. But they did vote to support the charter itself. That included that amazing preamble, which stated in its first article that one of the objectives of the United Nations itself was, quote, in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. Beautiful words. But I just praised a document signed by Stalin and the creators of South African apartheid. Britain and France, both oppressive colonial powers at the time, also signed both documents, as did the United States, which practiced racial, sexual, and religious discrimination and didn't have a record in the developing world that was above reproach. Far from it. The hypocrisy of proclaiming that all human beings are free and equal in dignity and human rights, while at the same time waging wars to defend colonialism and neocolonialism and practicing sexism, racism, and religious discrimination both at home and abroad is glaring. If we can't practice what we preach, does that mean that what we're preaching isn't worth embracing? I fear that many of us say no. We were inspired by the words that the world's leaders put on paper and praised in public. And we were disillusioned by how they didn't behave as if they really believed them. Humankind proudly proclaim that we don't hold our differences against each other, yet all over the world and at every level, we can be found doing precisely that. This brings up two important issues that don't get the kind of attention they deserve: hypocrisy and the evolutionary origins of divisive identity politics. If a nation, group, or individual speaks out on behalf of noble and inspiring values, but behave in ways that are clearly contrary to those values, should we use those behaviors, as a criticism of those values themselves? Do we judge them unrealistic? Do we say that there are hypocrites because they don't conform to their stated values? There's an ancient view that humans are an admixture of different elements of varying purity. And there are also modern arguments that suggest that our brains are more like committees, composed of members that often don't even get along, much less agree. It may very well be the case that one element within us believes one thing, and that another element within us believes something very different. For example, while writing this, it occurred to me that it would be a great idea to go heat up some leftover mashed potatoes and gravy. There's another side of me that is saying that the pants I was wearing pre-pandemic are really nice and they don't fit anymore, which is why I have no business going upstairs and loading up the microwave oven. I absolutely believe heating up some comfort food is a fantastic idea. And I believe it's a terrible one. Of course it's contradictory, but I'm a human being and not a computer. Whether this contradiction exists within me because I'm a mixture of elements or because my mind is a committee of sorts, it's normal. It might be helpful to change Article 1 of the UDHR to say that all human beings are endowed with flaws, inconsistencies, and internal divisions that prevent us from being the people we wish to be. And that our imperfections are not reasons to deny us of free and equal dignity and rights. Of course, there are some hypocrites who don't believe what they say and are just being manipulative. But I really do believe that I should eat better and exercise more, even when I don't actually do so. When I ate that second plate at Thanksgiving dinner, and when I stayed in bed on Black Friday instead of going to the gym, did I prove that I don't really believe that I should eat better and exercise more? There are those who would say yes. Most of us are kinder, thank you, and accept that things aren't so simple. Giving people the benefit of the doubt and asserting that their hypocrisy is more like my issue with diet and exercise than of them being terrible and manipulative people who suffer from personality disorders makes it easier to find the good in others, even when they fail to live up to their own standards, much less ours. If the opposite of hypocrisy isn't perfection, What could it be? Because none of us can attain perfection. I say that the opposite of hypocrisy is cynicism. The cynic declares that anyone who professes a standard they can't maintain and at all times is demonstrating the invalidity of that standard itself. I think cynicism is like piling more and more rocks onto our bike racks. Pedaling becomes harder. We get winded. We take longer and longer breaks. The tires go flat. We don't take our eyes off the path. We quit riding. So what if I broke my diet? The solution is simple. We need to forgive ourselves and each other for being hypocrites who cannot live up to our own standards. This is what ethical humanists do. We seek the good in each other because we possess the faith that it is there. We're not finding that faith. We're renewing it. This is important because the wonderful documents like the UDHR have an enforcement mechanism that don't work unless we focus on seeing the good in each other rather than our failures. Now, I want to briefly make an important observation about identity politics, and I think we need to talk about this a little more. Seeking out each other's inadequacies and unworthiness seems to be its heart. We don't pay attention to one of the key reasons we have such a strong tendency to do it. Everyone tells us that discrimination exists because we focus on our differences and not on what we have in common. We're scientifically minded people here at the Ethical Society. If anybody suggested that human behaviors, like those of all other animals, are subject to reinforcements, there would be no disagreement. Most of us agree that humans, like our fellow animals, evolved in a competitive environment for resources. The need for food, water, and shelter we have in common with other animals. We also have lots of other limited resources for which we compete, like acceptance, approval, respect. And it's a long list. Because both social and physical resources are limited, and there are never going to be enough to go around, and because, like all animal and plant populations, humans always expand to the limits of the resources available to them. The situation will always arise where something's got to give. Most of us are familiar with the science fiction storyline where a spaceship crew is confronted by an unexpected disaster, where there isn't enough food, water, and oxygen to make it back home. Someone inevitably will come up with a reason that somebody else should get tossed into the airlock and spaced. There's actually a word for that. If you aren't that person, you have a vested interest in going along with whatever pretext is presented, no matter how absurd. We're not spacing our crewmate because they possess a difference, be honest. We're seeking out a difference just to get an excuse to toss them out of the airlock. From the perspective of how evolutionary adaptation works in competition for scarce resources, we don't discriminate against each other because of the differences between us. We identify differences between us so that we may discriminate against each other. There can be no universal equality among humanity until we dispense with the reward structures that come with labeling other people as them. We don't just witness these identifications of people as them across nations, religions, languages, groups, and races. Pick any three people on the planet, get them together for any length of time, and I guarantee you that you will witness some variation of that theme emerge. The tendency to do that is baked into the human psyche. Spinoza was a strict determinist, as are a lot of secular people. Stoically, he said that there's no point in ascribing malice to the actions of other people because they are not in control of their actions. If it rains on our picnic, we generally don't call the weather malevolent. By that view, people have no more control over what they do than the weather has to decide to wreck our meal. Well, I don't share that view that there really isn't any such thing as free will and the ability to make moral choices. The view that there are all kinds of hidden reinforcements that put thumbs on the balance of our deliberation, it makes it easier to give other people, institutions, and in nations a bit more of a break. We can fix the structural problems that create one. That's not what is holding humanity back. What's holding us back is our reluctance to give each other a break, to give each other the benefit of the doubt. The solution to this and the solution to hypocrisy are the same. We need to recommit ourselves to seeking the good in each other and accept that the human condition is such that flaws are present in everyone, especially when we look as closely as our modern world enables us to do. The word reaffirm says it all. To save succeeding generations, we reaffirm faith in the dignity and worth of the human persons and in equal rights for everyone. We're not learning how to ride a bike. We already know how. We just have to hop on and get back to pedaling. Thank you.